Denodo Data Bites. Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of the Denodo Data Bites series. I'm your host Neha and today we are joined by Dominic Sartorio, VP of Product Marketing here at Denodo. Dominic brings a wealth of experience in the data realm from analytics to governance, integration security, and cloud infrastructure. Dominic, it's great to have you back on our podcast. Before we delve into today's topic, that is unlocking compliance, centralized governance in a data-driven world, could you give our listeners a brief introduction about yourself and your role at Denodo, please?
Yeah, thanks, Neha, and thanks for having me back on your podcast, these things. So yeah, my name is Dominic Sartorio. I'm the head of product marketing here at Denodo. Still pretty new here. Joined August of last year, so I guess within a year I'm still pretty new. But yeah, I've been in the data management space a long time, over 20 years of experience as a product leader, engineering in the field, and more recently marketing and product marketing. I've worked at companies, various companies, Informatica. I've also worked in the data security and privacy space. So I do bring a lot of perspectives to the table here around governance, risk management, and compliance as it relates to data. And I'm excited the opportunity to talk about it here today.
Perfect. Thank you, Dominic. Let's jump right in then and we can start talking about governance and risk and compliance today, as you mentioned. So my first question for you is how can organizations effectively centralize governance, risk, and compliance efforts across their distributed data landscape to ensure compliance with various regulations like GDPR, HIPAA, and financial reporting?
Yeah, great question. That's the big challenge many organizations are facing these days, because they do have to deal with a lot of regulations like GDPR, which is the European Union's data privacy regulations. There's HIPAA, which is the healthcare data regulations in the United States. And there's many more. It's like there's an alphabet soup out there of regulations that organizations do struggle to keep up with. And the reason why they struggle is because, well, data is all over the place, right? You've got organizations sharing data across the enterprise and even outside their enterprise with their customers and partners. You got data being migrated to the cloud or being shared across data lakes. So it's a big challenge to not only keep up with all the regulations, but then you have to apply the policies and enforce those policies across a huge and distributed data landscape. So that then leads to the need that you pointed out in your question, which is they want to be able to centralize defining and enforcing these policies without having to go all over the place where all the data may be originating. But how do you do that? So, what many organizations have tried to do is say, well, let's centralize the data itself. Because if we centralize the data itself, then that's the one place I go where I can centrally manage my policies and enforce them. But the problem is, and as I've talked about on this podcast in the past, centralizing the data itself is itself inherently hard. It can be expensive and time consuming to move that data and transform it so that it is consistent and centrally located. And then the data itself is frequently changing, so you got to keep it updated. New data sources are coming online all the time, and then you have to find them and move them as well. So if the way you do this is by centralizing the data itself, it's hard to keep up. So what many organizations, and of course Denodo's customers, are doing is they say, we're not going to centralize the data itself necessarily. We'll just use the power of Denodo as a powerful logical data management platform to allow the data itself to just stay wherever it is, right? But what we're centralizing is the access. We're centralizing where people go to get access to data for whatever the use case is, right? If they're building an intelligent app, or they're using AI, or it's just analytics, or regulatory reporting, right? So many regulators require that you have to report to them your compliance or prove your compliance through reports. And the data that shows up in these reports is going to come from various different sources. So let's centralize the access and then let Denodo, the power of the logical data platform, run that distributed query and only bring back only the data is needed for those specific reports or for access to whoever asked for it. So then it's in that central logical management layer then that you can run all your compliance reports and apply your compliance policies and enforce them and make sure that you are in compliance. So all of that can be centrally done in the logical data layer without having to move the data itself. So the data itself can stay wherever it is, wherever the organization needs it for other purposes, and let Denodo do its thing, run the federated queries, bring back only what needs to be bring back. And then it's through that central access layer where you're managing policies appropriately. So that's the right way to centralize GRC from our perspective.
Perfect. Thanks a lot for sharing, Dominic. This brings to my next question. So, how can centralized governance mechanisms address the challenge of ethical AI, such as ensuring correctness, explainability, and legality of AI driven decisions?
Yeah, that's the next set of regulations coming out, right? As if the data privacy regulations and the regular financial regulations and other regulations weren't enough. Now there's AI regulations. So in the European Union, they're still working on their AI Act, which spells out pretty clearly by category of use case the kinds of monitoring and governance and compliance you need to have. And in other parts of the world are picking up legislation that mirrors the EU's AI Act, like Singapore is picking up, and that's becoming a model through most of East Asia. And even in the United States, you hear Congress, our national government is also starting to look at, how do we enforce ethical AI? So this is coming up, and without going into the weeds of what the AI Act does, I mean, that could be its own podcast. Essentially, it does require that you have a way of answering the question, how did the AI come up with that answer, right? And like if you look at ChatGPT, you prompt it, you ask it a question, it comes back with an answer, right? And the answer may not make sense, it might be hallucinating, right? But you're obligated to be able to prescribe, how did it come up with that answer? What data did it look at to come up with that answer? And that's a way of determining, was there any bias in that answer by looking at the data that it came from. Was the data itself trustworthy, for example? So that's one part of the regulation. So with Denodo, you're able to do that. So Denodo has an integration with ChatGPT, and there are other large language models on the roadmap. And the way that Denodo works is this: you can ask a question that can be answered only by looking at the enterprise data. For example, a question like, okay, what are the top 10 stores around the world by revenue? Or what are my top 10 selling products? And then ChatGPT converts that into SQL, right, using the metadata inherent in the Denodo platform. And then we're executing that SQL like any other, and we provide an answer to ChatGPT, which then converts it to a human natural language response. So you get your answer. Through that conversion to SQL, we know what that SQL was. We know what the metadata was that it's based on. Of course, we know what data that SQL returned because Denodo is executing that, and we log it, right? So that way you can comply with the EU's AI Act, at least the part that says you need to be able to explain how Gen AI came up with his answer, because we're executing that query, we see what data it accessed, and we log that, right? And you can share those logs in order to comply with that regulation. Another part of the EU's AI Act, and I'm going back to the AI Act all the time because that does seem to be the model that most of the world is following. Another part of the AI Act is data privacy and handling of sensitive data. Like, you got to make sure that the AI is not somehow leaking sensitive data in its responses. So going back to ChatGPT, let's say instead of just asking, what are the top 10 selling products or top 10 selling whatever, somebody with nefarious intent decided to ask, well, tell me everything you know about this customer or about this person, right? And you can imagine some people could be quite clever in how they ask those questions in a way to try to circumvent whatever guardrails the AI might have. So here too, Denodo can help because we have rich access control functionality within our product, both role-based and attribute-based. And you can go right down to the field level, like what a client is allowed to see. And we can treat Gen AI or any AI like any other user of Denodo, limiting what it can actually see, what it can actually work with. So that's the most straightforward way to provide to have a data privacy guardrail in place. The AI, it can only see certain data, or it can only see data that's de-identified or masked. but otherwise it can still do its thing. And we have other features on the roadmap for how can you more carefully control what answers the AI gives back. So those are two things that Denodo does that can help organizations comply with these two critical parts of the EU's AI Act. The explainability part, with just being able to explain how to come up with an answer and making sure you're free of bias, as well as the data privacy and data sensitivity aspect with the access control capability we have in our product. So yeah, with Denodo, you can go a long way towards achieving ethical AI and complying with the emerging regulations out there.
Perfect. Thanks for sharing, Dominic. This was very interesting. So you mentioned that Denodo can help with compliance and with, complying with explainability and data privacy. But speaking a little bit more about what you were speaking earlier of ensuring data not being leaked by the Gen AI platform, right? So what role does centralized data governance play in capturing trustworthy data on resource consumption for reporting ESG, that is environmental, social, and governance metrics? And how can Denodo assist in consolidating and correlating data for a comprehensive view?
Yeah, answering your last question, I talked about how we have this great access control functionality. But as I said earlier, complying with regulations, you got to enforce policies across all the data that you own, and it could be very many data sources, applications, even third-party data, or you're sharing data with third parties, right? So it can be very hard to take an access control policy and then have to go to all those different source systems and applications and apply the same policy. It's a lot of work. It's manually intensive. You might forget one, right? So we hear about that all the time. But if you say, look, all the access of data is going to go through Denodo, that's your single point of access, then that's also the single place where you can apply these policies. So behind the scenes, Denodo is doing its thing. It's querying different data sources. It's pulling together that data in response to individual queries. But then it's in those responses is that one place where you can apply your access control policies. So one place to go. So you're not going to forget a data source. You also don't have to deal with the variations and the differences in how different data sources apply these policies. You just have to apply in one place, right in Denodo itself, and then you don't have to worry about all that back-end complexity. Right now, that's for access controls. What about regulatory reporting? And you brought up sustainability, right? Data on resource consumption. And there's financial regulatory reporting. So reporting that, like, for example, if you're a bank, do you have adequate controls of your capital and how much risk you're incurring on the financial markets, for example? So that kind of regulatory reporting, it's not access control, it's a different kind of control, right? So it's a control around looking at what does the data say about what's actually happening in your business. Right? In the case of sustainability, you have to collect data on your resource consumption, right? Like how much power, electricity are your buildings consuming or are your computers consuming, right? Or if you're a supply chain company where you're shipping products around, you've got products being trucked around, how much energy are those trucks consuming, like gas, fuel consumed, for example. So in a typical enterprise, you've got all kinds of ways where resources are being consumed, right? Or if you're a bank and it's financial regulations, there are all kinds of ways that you're moving money around and you might be incurring risk, right? Whether it's risk in the financial markets or risks if you're an insurance company. There's all kinds of ways where you could be incurring risk just because what you're doing with your money, right? But you have data on all of that. You've got data on how much resource are you consuming in different parts of the organization. You have data on where your money is going and how it's being used. And there are ways of measuring that, right? So with Denodo, you can pull all that data together in one place. And through Denodo, you can define rules. Like if the data is saying you're using this much energy and that's too much, right? Or the data is saying you're incurring this much financial risk and it's too much. You can set alerts. You can alert somebody. You can and you can log it and you can report on it. So when it's time to generate reports for the regulators, like the EU this year here in 2024, they also, there's new legislation, the Sustainability Act, which requires reporting on your resource consumption. You can go to one place, You can generate that report. That report shows all your resource consumption. In addition to that, you logged all the alert conditions, right? So that way you can demonstrate your compliance posture. Like, okay, here we were out of compliance, but we're able to act on it because we alerted, and the regulators look for that too. So regardless of the regulatory use case, if you got to report on something, you're reporting on data, and you want to be able to pull all that data together and be able to report on it from one place without having to move that data or having to go to all these individual data sources and figuring out what's there. Let Denodo do that for you, right? And then you can also define controls. Like if the data says you're out of compliance in different ways, then you'll be able to detect that, and we can be your early warning system if you're out of compliance. So those are all the things Denodo can do, but it's really rooted in the concept of logical data management, that you don't have to move the data. You don't have to go to all of these individual systems to pull all that data together. You can just use the power of logical data management. You can report from one place. You can define controls in one place, right? And let the platform then apply those policies and controls wherever the data is, and be that one place that you can then report on that.
Perfect. That's very interesting to know. Thanks, Dominic. How can centralized risk management functions empowered by, technologies such as logical data management used by Denodo help organizations navigate geopolitical uncertainties and ensure compliance in this rapidly changing regulations across different regions that we have?
Yeah, great question. And we haven't talked about yet, which is agility and just the pace of change, which seems to be accelerating.
Right.
Well, definitely in regulatory compliance, it seems like every year multiple countries around the world are passing legislation that's compliance related, financial, sustainability, legal transparency, data privacy and security, right? All of which are creating this problem of how do we govern that? We have to apply policies, and then we have to get all the data together to report on that. And that pace of change is only increasing. Actually, here's a stat you may not have known. Did you know that in this year, 2024, over 80% of the world's population that lives in a democracy is having a national election all over the
Wow.
world? It's not just the United States. The
Hmm.
EU is having their parliamentary elections. India is having an election. I think there's like 40 or 50 democracies around the world that are having elections this year alone. And we've never seen that before. It's just the way that the 4, 5, or 6 year cadences are falling out, that they all seem to intersect on the year 2024. So just the possibility of there being dramatic changes in government policies and dramatic changes in regulations. Some of it could just be done by fiat, like executive orders on the first day of whoever happened to win the election coming to power, right?
Right.
If organizations are not ready for this, I don't know how you're going to comply. I don't know how you're going to react. But Denodo makes it possible for you to react. There is a meme kind of going around the compliance circles these days called compliance by design, right? And this riffs off of the idea of privacy by design. I think many listeners of this podcast may have heard that term before. Privacy by design is a concept that's been out there at least for the last 10 or 15 years. What privacy by design says, as you're building new data architectures, like you're standing up a data lake for the first time, or you're migrating to the cloud for the first time, or you're building your data fabric or your data mesh for the first time, design in right from the very beginning. Make privacy a feature of that new data architecture, right? And instead of like standing up a new data architecture and then you have to retrofit data privacy later, right? That's always a lot harder to do. You're bolting things on, separate tools, and it just slows everybody down, right? And especially
True.
people who want to start using that new data platform. And then, oh, wait, I can't use it yet because you can't guarantee I'm using it in a compliant way. Okay, and that just slows everybody down. So Denodo lets you do privacy by design because of all the access control functionality that I talked about earlier. But privacy is just one aspect of compliance, right? All the other compliance regulations that we're talking about, the different regulatory reporting, sustainability, financial, and otherwise, that's another one, right? Now what people are asking is, how do I design that kind of compliance in, right? How do I make sure that I can easily generate reports that include data from all over my organization to prove that I'm in compliance, right? And whenever I'm not in compliance, how can I get an early warning of how can I set up an early warning system and alert the right people so I can correct it right away? How can I design that in to the data architectures where I know all this data is gonna flow through at some point? So that's called compliance by design. Having the ability to report, having the ability to define and enforce these controls is a feature of the data platform itself. Well, Denodo does all of that, right? So
Mm-hmm.
through Denodo, you can design compliance in. And when compliance is designed in, it's just a feature of your data platform, just like everything else you're doing in your data platform. So whenever there are dramatic changes in government regulations where suddenly you have to comply with something you didn't have to do it before, it is very easy in Denodo to define that control, like set up that rule, right? This data needs to demonstrate these aspects of my business. I'm consuming only so much resource, or my financial risks are characterized in a certain way, or whatever it is. If it's something that can be possibly described through data, you're able to do it in Denodo. So, and you can do it very quickly. You don't have to bolt on another tool. It's not another big data engineering effort, right? It's not something that's going to slow down or disrupt the business, because it is just an inherent part of the functionality of Denodo, just part of the day-to-day usage of the Denodo platform. So that way you can implement compliance by design, and you can respond that much more quickly whenever there are changes in the regulatory environment or new laws being passed and things like that. So that way you can keep up with change that much faster.
Definitely. Thanks for sharing, Dominic. So we've spoken a lot about data governance, risk, and compliance today, but I wanted to know a few customer stories from your end. So would you be able to share some customer stories on how Denodo helps unify disparate data sources into a single access layer and address the challenges of proving compliance, ensuring data privacy, and managing risks effectively without sacrificing agility, like you were mentioning previously, and competitiveness?
Yeah, there's a few that we can talk about. So first, let's start with financial. And I just had a good interaction with this account team. That's why it comes to mind. The Johannesburg Stock Exchange. So Johannesburg, South Africa, right? They have a vibrant stock market. I think it's the biggest market capitalization in all of Africa. They use Denodo for all of their anti-fraud, so fraud detection and risk management, right? And so, and you do this through math, right? They of course have data on all transactions, all trades that happen through that stock exchange. All of that is accessible through a single point of access governed by Denodo, right? And they have data privacy access control there. But they also do anti-fraud. So they are able to define rules, right, that define what are the conditions where fraud might be occurring, right? Usually it's a pattern of trades from certain market participants that can indicate that, right? So through Denodo and through our single layer, we provide that single data layer. They were able to then define rules on top of that to detect potential fraud situations. And also just risk management, measuring the inherent risks in the market, right? And measuring, okay, could a market maker be or a big member bank be in trouble, right? So things like the 2008 financial crisis can't happen anymore because day to day, hour to hour, minute to minute, they're measuring the risks that are inherent in their capital markets and reporting on those risks. So that's a great example from a financial regulatory perspective. We have others for data privacy, like ING Barings Bank. They did a successful GDPR implementation with Denodo, which is all about not just access controls, but also monitoring where and how sensitive data is being used. And then they can also detect for potential unusual behavior, like if a bad actor maybe hijacked somebody's account and that account is allowed to see data, but the human being behind it wasn't. And another company, a big retailer, a supermarket chain here in the United States called Albertsons, they use Denodo as a customer 360, so they can do customer loyalty and campaign management. And they did a lot to make sure that all those use cases, customer loyalty, campaign analytics, campaign management, is done in a privacy compliant manner, right? So they use Denodo to enforce those access controls and also do the usage tracking that I mentioned earlier. We have healthcare organizations like Vancouver Coastal Health. They use us to ensure privacy compliance for personal health or PHI information. SA Health is another one, South African health organization. So there's other healthcare organizations, Australia and around the world that have done this with us. And I could go on, but there's quite a few customers that have done this where they've essentially designed compliance in to their data architecture through Denodo. Denodo represents that single place where they can go. It's a single point of access for all data that the regulators need or all use cases that could potentially be regulated. And that's the one place you can go to define your access controls and also define other controls and guardrails so you can detect for out of compliance situations and have an early warning system around that. A lot of great customer case studies to talk about here.
Definitely. And thank you for sharing so many examples across various industries, from healthcare to banking and so on. So this was a fantastic discussion, Dominic. Thank you for talking to us about data governance, risk and compliance today. Before we wrap up our session today, would you be interested in a quick Q&A round?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. Go for it.
Perfect. If you could have dinner with any historical figure, dead or alive, who would it be and why?
My God, dead or alive? That's a good one. Well, the live one is easiest. I mean, I'd love to have a dinner with Elon Musk and just figure out what is he thinking, right? Because I mean, he is kind of a maverick out there these days. But I mean, if you look at just the course of his life, just like the brilliance, going all the way back to the PayPal days, and then getting Tesla to actually work, and as a company, not just the engineering marvels that those cars represent. And everything else he's doing, you just kind of want to understand what goes on in a mind like that, right? And what advice could he offer, and what lessons could you glean? So that's one. Now, if I go back to a historical figure, and I guess I just saw the movie Oppenheimer recently. I mean, there's another guy, very much an iconoclast, right? And obviously a brilliant physicist and theoretical physicist, but then he's able to get hands-on practical and pull off something like the Manhattan Project, right? So and I mean, that's really like a good leadership lesson, actually. How is somebody who, if you look at them in their youth and their early career, you don't think of as like a natural leader. I mean, they were brilliant individually, but they were able to pull off something like the Manhattan Project. I just want to hear the story, right? Like,
True.
Like what was going on in your mind and how did you pivot like psychologically to be able to pull off something like this, and what were the challenges and how you overcame them? So yeah, those are the two that come to mind just off the cuff.
Definitely, and really brilliant answers here. And what's a hobby or an interest that you would like to explore in the near future?
Well, there's one hobby I really enjoy and don't do it nearly enough. I really love the outdoors. I like hiking. I like being out in nature. But you can imagine the day job that I have. I'm sitting at a desk and I'm on video calls or just pounding at my keyboard all day. You kind of these sedentary sort of jobs, and you don't get out much. I look forward to the day when I'm not like working as much and I could just be outside more, wherever that is. I live in California with just lots of natural beauty around here. Just like to hike up the hills, or, I also like skiing. So just love the outdoors, even in winter environments. I love to go to travel to different parts of the world and experience their natural wonders. So that's something I'd love to do more. And for me, I think being outdoors represents a good balance between the desk job that's mentally intensive, and then just being outdoors where it's more physically intensive, but it gives the brain something completely different to focus on, right? And I think that represents like a good balance. So yeah, it's something I like doing and I'm not doing nearly enough of, and need to do more of it.
Thank you so much, Dominic. And this was a really great episode to have a chat with you on data governance, risk, and compliance. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
And a quick message to our listeners. If you've enjoyed this episode, please head over to denodo.com/podcast to find out more resources on all things data.